Sometimes the greatest acts of love come with the heaviest prices. In a world where family loyalty should be sacred, what happens when protecting the innocent makes you the enemy? This is the story of Elena Martinez, a young woman who discovered that standing up for what's right can cost you everything you've ever known. But sometimes, when all hope seems lost, salvation arrives on horseback, wearing worn leather boots and carrying a heart big enough to heal old wounds. What you're about to read isn't just a story about sacrifice and redemption. It's about the power of unconditional love, the courage to stand alone when everyone else turns away, and the miraculous way life can surprise us when we least expect it. Elena's journey will take you from the dusty streets of a small Texas border town to the vast open ranges where second chances bloom like wildflowers after rain. Get ready for a tale that proves sometimes being cast out is just the beginning of finding where you truly belong. Elena Martinez stood in the doorway of the small adobe house she had called home for 23 years, her hands trembling as she held the single suitcase that contained her entire life. Behind her, the voices of her family echoed with anger and disappointment, words that cut deeper than any blade ever could. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard, and for a moment, she wondered if this was all just a terrible nightmare from which she would soon wake. The trouble had started 6 months earlier, when her younger sister Sophia came home from school, with bruises on her arms and a haunted look in her dark eyes. At 15, Sophia had always been the family's bright star, the one everyone said would make something of herself and lift the Martinez name to new heights. She was smart, beautiful, and had dreams of becoming a teacher. But something had changed in her during the spring semester, something that made her flinch when anyone raised their voice and caused her to spend hours staring out her bedroom window at nothing at all. Elena had tried to talk to her parents about her concerns, but Papa always dismissed such things as women's worries. Mama was too busy working double shifts at the local diner to notice the subtle changes in her youngest daughter. The Martinez family had always been traditional, with clear expectations about respect for elders and keeping family matters private. Questions about Sophia's new behavior were met with sharp reminders that good daughters didn't create trouble or spread gossip about their betters. It was Elena who finally discovered the truth on a Tuesday evening in late September. She had been working late at the small grocery store where she stocked shelves and ran the cash register, saving every penny she could to help with the family's expenses. When she came home, she found Sophia sitting on the back steps, her school uniform torn and her face streaked with tears. The story came out in broken whispers and choked sobs that made Elena's blood run cold with rage. Mr. Hernandez, the respected high school principal and family friend who had been coming to their house for years, had been forcing Sophia to stay after school for what he called special tutoring sessions. These sessions had nothing to do with academics, and everything to do with his twisted desires and the power he held over a vulnerable young girl. He had convinced Sophia that no one would believe her if she spoke up, that her family would be destroyed if anyone found out, and that she would be responsible for ruining a good man's reputation over her own lies. Elena held her sister that night as Sophia trembled and cried, pouring out months of fear, shame, and confusion. She had tried to avoid Mr. Betty Hernandez, but he always found ways to corner her, always had reasons why she needed to stay late or come in early. He had threatened her grades, her college recommendations, and even her family's standing in the community if she didn't cooperate. For a 15-year-old girl from a family that struggled financially, these threats felt like chains she couldn't break. The next morning, Elena marched into the principal's office with fire in her eyes and determination in her heart. She demanded that Mr. Hernandez stop his abuse of her sister and threatened to go to the police if he didn't resign immediately. The man who had been a fixture in their community for over 20 years, who was respected at church and considered a pillar of society, laughed in her face. He told her that no one would believe the wild accusations of two troublemaking girls against a man of his standing. He reminded her that her family depended on the good graces of people like him, that her father's construction job and her mother's position at the diner could easily disappear if certain people decided they were no longer trustworthy. But Elena wasn't backing down. She had seen too much pain in her sister's eyes to let fear stop her from fighting for justice. She went to the police station that same afternoon, only to be met with skeptical looks and uncomfortable silences. Officer Rodriguez, who had gone to school with Mr. Hernandez and considered him a close friend, suggested that perhaps Sophia had misunderstood the principal's intentions. Maybe she had developed an inappropriate crush and was now embarrassed about it. These things happened with teenage girls, after all. They often imagined romantic situations where none existed. When Elena insisted that her sister was telling the truth, Officer Rodriguez's tone became sharper. He warned her about the serious consequences of making false accusations against respected members of the community. He reminded her that slander and defamation were serious charges, and that the Martinez family might find themselves in legal trouble if they continued spreading lies about Mr. Hernandez. The message was clear: drop the matter or face the consequences. Elena spent the next few weeks gathering evidence and trying to find other victims. She discovered that Sofia wasn't the first girl to suffer at the hands of Mr. Hernandez, but fear and shame had kept the others silent. Some families had quietly moved away rather than face the scandal. Others had been convinced to keep quiet through a combination of threats and bribes. The principal had perfected a system of abuse that relied on his victims' powerlessness and the community's unwillingness to believe that such a respected man could be capable of such acts. The breaking point came when Sofia attempted to take her own life. Elena found her sister unconscious in the bathroom, an empty bottle of sleeping pills on the floor beside her. The rushed trip to the hospital, the stomach pumping, the psychiatric evaluation that followed, all of it could have been avoided if someone had listened, if someone had cared enough to investigate the truth, instead of protecting a predator's reputation. As Sofia lay in the hospital bed, pale and fragile, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She called the regional newspaper and told a reporter named Maria Santos everything she knew about Mr. Appearing Hernandez and his pattern of abuse. She provided names of other victims, documented incidents, and her sister's medical records showing the psychological trauma that had driven her to attempt suicide. Maria Santos listened with the attention and respect that the local authorities had refused to provide. The story ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, with the headline, "Respected Principal Accused of Serial Abuse of Female Students." The article was carefully written with legal disclaimers and quotes from experts about the patterns of institutional abuse. It included statements from 3 other former students who had finally found the courage to speak out. And it painted a picture of a man who had used his position of power to prey on vulnerable young women for years. The reaction from the community was swift and brutal, but not in the way Elena had hoped. Instead of rallying around the victims and demanding justice, many people closed ranks around Mr. Hernandez. He was a respected member of society, they said. He had helped so many students over the years. These were obviously false accusations made by troubled girls seeking attention or trying to get back at a strict authority figure. The Martinez family was known for causing drama, they whispered. Elena had always been rebellious, never knowing her place or showing proper respect for her betters. The threats started almost immediately. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, warning Elena to keep her mouth shut or face the consequences. Vandalism to their property, with slurs painted on their fence and windows broken in the night. Elena's mother lost her job at the diner when the owner decided that having her there was bad for business. Her father found that construction jobs suddenly became scarce, with former clients expressing concerns about hiring someone from such a controversial family. The final blow came during Sunday Mass at San Miguel Catholic Church, where the Martinez family had worshipped for 3 generations. Father O'Brien, an elderly priest who had baptized both Elena and Sofia, delivered a sermon about the dangers of bearing false witness and the importance of forgiveness. He spoke about how the devil could work through weak-willed individuals to destroy good men and tear apart the fabric of community trust. The message was clear to everyone in the congregation, and the stares and whispers that followed the family out of church that morning told Elena everything she needed to know about their future in this town. That evening, Elena's father called a family meeting. Roberto Martinez was a man of few words, weathered by years of hard labor and the weight of providing for his family in a world that offered few opportunities for men like him. He sat at the kitchen table with his calloused hands folded in front of him and looked at his eldest daughter with eyes full of pain and disappointment. He told Elena that her actions had brought shame and ruin to their family name. Whether Mr. Murder Hernandez was guilty or innocent was no longer the point. The damage was done. They could no longer live in this town, could no longer hold their heads up in public, could no longer provide for themselves as they had before. All because Elena had decided to involve outsiders in what should have been handled quietly within the family or the church. Elena tried to explain that she had only been protecting Sofia, that silence had nearly cost her sister's life. But her father's mind was made up. He told her that she had a choice. She could publicly apologize for the lies she had spread, admit that she had misunderstood the situation and influenced her sister to make false accusations, and beg the community's forgiveness. If she did this, perhaps they could begin to rebuild their reputation and their lives. Or she could leave, pack her things, take her shame with her, and never return. The family would tell people that they had disowned her for her lies and manipulation. They would move to another town, start over, and try to heal the wounds she had created. But Elena could not be part of that healing process. Her presence would only serve as a reminder of the scandal she had created. The choice was impossible and heartbreaking, but for Elena, it wasn't really a choice at all. She could not and would not apologize for protecting her sister. She could not admit to lies when she knew she had spoken the truth. She could not sacrifice her principles and her integrity for the sake of peace, even if it meant losing everything she had ever known and loved. Sophia, who had been released from the hospital but was still fragile and withdrawn, begged Elena not to leave. She blamed herself for everything that had happened and offered to say that she had made up the whole story. But Elena wouldn't allow her sister to sacrifice herself on the altar of community comfort. The truth was the truth, regardless of how inconvenient it might be for everyone else. Elena's mother wept as she helped her daughter pack the single suitcase. Carmen Martinez was a woman caught between her love for her children and her loyalty to her husband and community. She pressed a rosary into Elena's hand and whispered a prayer for her protection, but she couldn't bring herself to say that Elena was wrong to leave or right to stay. The situation had become bigger than any of them, a force that was tearing apart everything they had built together. As Elena walked toward the bus station with her suitcase in hand, she turned back one last time to look at the small house where she had grown up. Sophia stood at the window of their shared bedroom, her hand pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her face. Elena raised her own hand in a gesture of goodbye and promise she would never forget her sister, would never stop fighting for her, even from a distance. The bus to San Antonio was nearly empty, giving Elena plenty of space to cry without witnesses. She had $43 in her pocket, the address of a women's shelter that Maria Santos had given her, and absolutely no idea what she was going to do with the rest of her life. All she knew was that she had done the right thing, even if it had cost her everything. Sometimes doing what's right requires sacrifices that feel too heavy to bear, but the alternative, living with the knowledge that her silence had enabled a predator to continue hurting innocent girls, was unthinkable. As the bus pulled away from the only town she had ever known, Elena pressed her face to the window and watched the familiar landmarks disappear into the distance. The small grocery store where she had worked, the church where she had been confirmed, the school where Sophia should have been safe, all of it fading away like memories from someone else's life. She thought about the women's shelter where she was headed, about the uncertain future that lay ahead, about the sister she was leaving behind to heal in a family that could no longer include her. The pain was overwhelming, a grief so deep it felt like drowning. But underneath the pain was something else, a quiet strength, a certainty that she had chosen love over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over peace. Elena Martinez was no longer part of the Martinez family. No longer welcome in the community where she had been born and raised. She was alone in the world, with nothing but her integrity and the hope that somewhere out there, someone would recognize the value of a woman who would risk everything to protect the innocent. She didn't know then that her greatest adventure was just beginning, or that the courage she had shown in standing up for Sophia would soon attract the attention of someone who understood the true meaning of honor and loyalty. The women's shelter in San Antonio was nothing like Elena had imagined. The safe harbor house stood on a quiet street lined with modest homes, its exterior deliberately unremarkable to protect the privacy of the women inside. When Elena knocked on the heavy wooden door with her single suitcase in hand, she was greeted by Margaret Thompson, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Margaret had been running Safe Harbor for 12 years, and she had seen every kind of story that could drive a woman to seek shelter. But as Elena sat in the small office and explained what had brought her there, Margaret found herself both impressed and heartbroken. It wasn't often that someone came to the shelter, not because they were fleeing their own abuse, but because they had sacrificed everything to protect someone else. The shelter had strict rules designed to keep everyone safe and help residents get back on their feet. Elena could stay for up to 90 days, during which time she would be expected to actively look for work, attend counseling sessions, and contribute to the daily operations of the house. She would share a room with another resident, follow a strict curfew, and participate in group meetings where women shared their stories and supported each other through their healing journeys. Elena's roommate was Carmen Flores, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s who had escaped an abusive marriage with her 2 young children. Carmen had been at the shelter for 6 weeks and was preparing to move into a subsidized apartment with the help of the shelter's transitional housing program. She welcomed Elena with gentle warmth, understanding the shell-shocked look of someone whose world had recently been turned upside down. The first few weeks at Safe Harbor were the hardest of Elena's life. During the day, she walked the hot streets of San Antonio looking for work, filling out applications at restaurants, retail stores, and office buildings. Her lack of experience beyond the small grocery store in her hometown made the job search frustrating and discouraging. Many employers seemed suspicious of her limited work history and her inability to provide references from previous supervisors who would give her positive recommendations. The evenings at the shelter were both comforting and painful. Listening to the other women's stories made Elena realize that suffering took many forms and that courage could be found in the smallest acts of resistance. There was Rosa, a teenager who had run away from home to escape her stepfather's advances. There was Janet, an older woman who had finally left her husband after 30 years of emotional and physical abuse. Each woman carried scars, but they also carried hope and an incredible strength that inspired Elena even in her darkest moments. The counseling sessions with Dr. Sarah Mitchell helped Elena process the guilt and grief that threatened to overwhelm her. Dr. Mitchell was a trauma specialist who understood the unique pain of being rejected by family for doing the right thing. She helped Elena see that her father's reaction came from his own fear and cultural conditioning, not from any failing on Elena's part. The sessions were difficult, often leaving Elena emotionally drained, but they slowly began to help her understand that she could build a new life without sacrificing her core values. After 3 weeks of job searching, Elena finally found work at Luna's Kitchen, a small Mexican restaurant in the historic Market Square area. The owner, Isabella Luna, was a fierce woman in her 60s who had built her business from nothing and had a soft spot for hard-working women who needed a second chance. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but Isabella offered steady hours, meals during shifts, and the kind of family atmosphere that Elena desperately missed. Working at Luna's Kitchen was physically demanding but emotionally healing. Elena started as a prep cook, chopping vegetables and preparing ingredients in the hot kitchen alongside Maria and Consuela, 2 women who had been with Isabella for years. They taught her the recipes and techniques that made Luna's food special, and they gradually drew her into their easy camaraderie of shared work and gentle teasing. Isabella took a particular interest in Elena, perhaps recognizing something of her younger self in this woman who had lost everything for the sake of principle. During quiet moments between the lunch and dinner rushes, Isabella would tell Elena stories of her own struggles as a young immigrant who had worked 3 jobs to save enough money to open her restaurant. She spoke about the importance of building new families when old ones failed you, and about the strength that came from surviving experiences that seemed impossible to endure. Elena's relationship with her biological family remained complicated and painful. She called home once a week, speaking briefly with her mother, who always sounded nervous and distracted. Sophia had returned to school but was still struggling with depression and anxiety. The family had not moved to another town as planned because Roberto had finally found steady work again, but the shadow of the scandal still hung over them. Eleanor's name was never mentioned during these conversations, as if speaking of her might reopen wounds that were only beginning to heal. Mr. Hernandez had been quietly transferred to another school district, his departure explained as a promotion rather than an admission of guilt. No formal charges were ever filed, despite the testimony of multiple victims. The message to the community was clear. The scandal was over, the troublemakers were gone, and life could return to normal. The truth had been buried under layers of denial and willful ignorance, but Elena carried it with her like a sacred responsibility. As the weeks passed, Elena began to find her footing in San Antonio. She moved from prep cook to line cook at Luna's Kitchen, earning a small raise and the respect of her co-workers. She found a tiny studio apartment in an older building not far from the restaurant, finally having a space that was completely her own. The apartment was sparse and humble, furnished with items donated by the shelter and a few things she bought secondhand, but it represented freedom and independence in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The loneliness was often overwhelming, especially in the evenings when she sat in her small apartment and thought about Sophia. She wondered if her sister was eating properly, if she was sleeping through the night, if she had found a way to heal from the trauma that had nearly destroyed her. Elena wrote letters that she never sent, full of love and encouragement, and promises that she would always be there if Sophia needed her, even from a distance. It was during one of these lonely evenings in late November that Elena made a decision that would change the trajectory of her new life. She had been thinking about the other girls who had been victimized by Mr. Hernandez, wondering if they were finding ways to heal and move forward. She realized that her own experience at Safe Harbor had shown her the power of women supporting each other through difficult times, and she began to imagine ways she could use her story to help others. Elena started volunteering at a local organization that provided support for sexual assault survivors. She began with simple tasks like answering phones and filing paperwork, but gradually, she started sharing her own story with newly arrived clients, who were struggling with the same feelings of isolation and self-doubt that had nearly consumed her. Her experience of being rejected by her family for speaking the truth resonated with many women who had faced similar choices between silence and safety. The volunteer work was emotionally challenging but deeply rewarding. Elena discovered that she had a natural gift for listening without judgment and for helping others see their own strength even in their darkest moments. The organization's director, Linda Rodriguez, began to rely on Elena's insights and suggested that she consider pursuing formal training in counseling or social work. The idea of returning to school was both exciting and daunting. Elena had graduated from high school with good grades, but college had always seemed like an impossible dream for someone from her family's economic background. Linda helped her research scholarship opportunities and community college programs that could provide a pathway to a career in social services. For the first time since leaving home, Elena began to see a future that extended beyond simple survival. As winter approached, Elena had been in San Antonio for nearly 4 months. She had built a small but meaningful life, with work that sustained her, volunteer activities that gave her purpose, and a growing network of women who had become like sisters to her. She was stronger than she had ever been, more confident in her ability to navigate the world on her own terms, and more certain that her decision to speak the truth had been the right one, regardless of its cost. But late at night, when the city grew quiet and her small apartment felt too empty, Elena still grieved for the family she had lost and the sister she had been forced to leave behind. She wondered if Sophia thought about her, if their parents ever regretted their ultimatum, if there would ever be a way to bridge the divide that her courage had created. The pain was a constant companion, a reminder of the price that came with standing up for what was right in a world that often preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. Elena had no way of knowing that miles away, on a ranch outside the city, someone was about to enter her life who would understand her sacrifice better than anyone she had ever met. Someone who knew what it meant to stand alone for the sake of principle, who had his own experience with being cast out for refusing to compromise his values. Someone who would see past her careful independence to the loneliness and longing she tried so hard to hide, and who would offer her something she thought she had lost forever: a place to belong, a family to call home, and a love strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds. The stage was being set for a meeting that would change everything, but Elena continued her daily routine, unaware that her greatest adventure was about to begin. She went to work at Luna's kitchen, attended her counseling sessions, volunteered at the support center, and slowly, carefully built a life that was authentically her own. She was learning that sometimes being cast out was just the first step toward finding where you truly belonged, even if the journey was longer and more difficult than anyone should have to endure. Christmas was approaching, and Elena was preparing to spend her first holiday season away from family. Isabella had invited her to join the Luna's kitchen staff for their traditional Christmas Eve celebration, and Elena was looking forward to being part of a chosen family's traditions. She had no way of knowing that before the new year arrived, a stranger on horseback would ride into her carefully constructed world and offer her something she thought she had given up forever: the chance to come home. Jake Sullivan first heard Elena's story on a cold December morning while waiting for his truck to be repaired at Rodriguez Auto Shop in San Antonio. He had been in the city to pick up supplies for the ranch and was killing time reading week-old newspapers when he came across a follow-up article about the principal abuse scandal from the small border town. The reporter, Maria Santos, had written a piece about the aftermath of her investigation, focusing on the courage of the young woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her sister and expose the truth. Jake read the article twice, his jaw tightening with each detail about how the community had turned against Elena and her family. At 31, Jake had seen enough of the world to recognize genuine courage when he encountered it, and he was both impressed and outraged by what Elena had endured. The article didn't mention her by name or current location, but it painted a picture of a young woman whose integrity had cost her everything she held dear. Jake Sullivan was the foreman of the Double Creek Ranch, a sprawling cattle operation 2 hours north of San Antonio, owned by an elderly rancher named Thomas McKenna. Thomas was 73 years old and had been searching for someone to eventually take over the ranch when he could no longer manage it himself. Jake had been working for Thomas for 8 years, gradually taking on more responsibility and earning the older man's trust and respect. The Double Creek Ranch was more than just a business operation. It was a sanctuary for people who needed a second chance. Over the years, Thomas and Jake had hired ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives, veterans struggling with PTSD, and young people who had aged out of the foster care system with nowhere else to go. The ranch provided honest work, fair wages, and most importantly, a sense of family for people who had been rejected or forgotten by society. Jake himself had arrived at Double Creek 8 years earlier as a man running from his own painful past. He had been a police officer in Houston, dedicated to serving and protecting the public, until he discovered that several of his fellow officers were involved in a corruption scheme that included taking bribes from drug dealers and falsifying evidence. When Jake reported his findings to Internal Affairs, he was told to keep quiet and mind his own business. When he refused and threatened to go to the FBI, he found himself under investigation for fabricated charges of excessive force and evidence tampering. The investigation cleared him of any wrongdoing, but the damage was done. Jake's reputation was destroyed, his fellow officers treated him as a traitor, and he realized he could no longer work in law enforcement, knowing how easily the system could be corrupted by people who put personal gain above justice. He had resigned from the force and spent several months drifting from job to job, angry and disillusioned, until Thomas McKenna offered him work at the ranch. Thomas had seen the newspaper articles about Jake's situation and recognized a man of principle who had paid a heavy price for doing the right thing. He offered Jake not just a job, but a place to heal and rebuild his life, surrounded by people who understood that integrity sometimes came with a cost that seemed too high to bear. The ranch had become Jake's salvation, and he was passionate about extending the same opportunity to others who had lost everything for the sake of their values. 2 weeks after reading the article about Elena, Jake was in San Antonio again, this time to attend a livestock auction. He stopped at Luna's kitchen for dinner, drawn by the warm light and the smell of authentic Mexican cooking that reminded him of his childhood in South Texas. Isabella Luna seated him at a small table near the kitchen, and Jake found himself watching the efficient dance of the kitchen staff as they prepared orders during the dinner rush. It was Elena who caught his attention, though he didn't immediately connect her to the story he had read. She moved with quiet competence as she worked the grill, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her concentration complete, as she prepared each dish with obvious care and skill. There was something about her that drew his eye, a grace and dignity that seemed incongruous with the humble setting, as if she was meant for something greater than cooking in a small restaurant kitchen. When Isabella brought his order to the table, Jake complimented her on the excellent food and the obvious skill of her kitchen staff. Isabella's face lit up with pride as she talked about her employees, and when she mentioned Elena, she spoke with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had taken a wounded bird under her wing. "That girl has been through more than anyone should have to endure," Isabella said, lowering her voice so Elena couldn't hear. "She came to us with nothing but her dignity and her work ethic, and she's earned everything she's achieved here. She's studying to become a counselor, wants to help other women who've been through trauma. She has a heart bigger than Texas and more courage than most men I've known." Something in Isabella's words sparked Jake's memory, and he found himself looking at Elena with new understanding. Could this be the same woman from the newspaper article? The one who had been cast out for protecting her sister? The more he observed her quiet strength and the way she carried herself despite obvious hardship, the more convinced he became that fate had brought him to Luna's kitchen for a reason. Jake became a regular customer over the next few weeks, always asking to sit in Elena's section when she was working as a server during the slower afternoon shifts. He was careful not to make her uncomfortable with unwanted attention, but he found himself drawn to her gentle manner with customers and the way she seemed genuinely interested in making sure everyone felt welcome and cared for. Elena noticed the tall, quiet man who had begun eating lunch at Luna's several times a week. Jake Sullivan was different from most of their customers. There was something about his bearing that suggested strength and reliability, but also a deep sadness that he kept carefully hidden. He was always polite and respectful, left generous tips, and never tried to engage her in personal conversation beyond the normal pleasantries of taking his order. It was Isabella who finally played matchmaker, though she did it so subtly that neither Jake nor Elena realized what was happening. She began assigning Elena to serve Jake's table even when it wasn't her section, and she made sure to mention Elena's volunteer work and her plans to return to school. She spoke to Elena about Jake as well, mentioning that he worked on a ranch outside the city and seemed like the kind of man who understood the value of hard work and integrity. The conversation that would change both their lives happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in January. Elena was working alone in the dining room, as the lunch rush had ended and most customers had left to escape the sudden downpour. Jake was finishing his meal when Elena approached with the coffee pot to offer him a refill. Jake said quietly, "I've been reading about that situation down in your hometown, about the principal and the girl who spoke up to protect her sister." Elena's hand froze over his coffee cup, her face going pale as she realized he somehow knew her story. For a moment, she considered denying any knowledge of what he was talking about, but something in his eyes told her that deception would be pointless and unnecessary.
"How did you know?"
she asked, setting the coffee pot down with trembling hands. The article described someone with exactly your kind of courage, Jake said gently. And Isabella mentioned that you came here after standing up for your family even though it cost you everything. Elena sank into the chair across from him, too emotionally exhausted to maintain her usual professional distance. I did what anyone would have done, she said quietly. I protected my sister. I just didn't realize how much it would cost. Jake leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped on the table. Not everyone would have done what you did, he said seriously. Most people would have looked the other way, told themselves it wasn't their problem, or convinced themselves that they must be wrong about what was happening. It takes a special kind of strength to risk everything for someone else's safety. It doesn't feel like strength, Elena admitted, tears threatening to spill over. It feels like I destroyed my family. My sister barely speaks to me when I call home, and my parents act like I never existed. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. You made the only choice, Jake said firmly. I know something about what it costs to stand up for what's right when everyone around you wants you to stay quiet. I know what it feels like to lose everything because you couldn't live with yourself if you did nothing. Something in his tone made Elena look up and really see him for the first time. Behind his calm exterior, she recognized the same kind of pain that she carried, the grief that came from choosing principle over comfort, truth over acceptance. What happened to you? She asked softly. Jake told her about his years as a police officer, about discovering the corruption among his colleagues, and about the choice between staying silent or speaking up that had ultimately cost him his career and his sense of belonging. He spoke about the isolation and anger that had consumed him for months, and about how Thomas McKenna had offered him not just work, but a chance to rebuild his life around people who understood that integrity sometimes came with a price that seemed too heavy to bear. The ranch is more than just a place to work, Jake explained. It's a sanctuary for people who've been cast out for doing the right thing, or who just need a chance to prove themselves when nobody else will give them one. Thomas has been like a father to me, and the people who work there have become my family. We take care of each other because we understand what it means to lose everything and have to start over. Elena listened with growing fascination as Jake described life on the Double Creek Ranch. He told her about the other employees who had found refuge there. Marcus, a former gang member who had testified against his former associates and now worked with the horses. Sarah, a veteran who had struggled with PTSD until the healing environment of the ranch helped her find peace. And Danny, a young man who had aged out of foster care and learned responsibility and self-worth through caring for the cattle. We have a small house on the property that's empty right now, Jake said carefully. The woman who lived there moved on to nursing school last year, and Thomas has been hoping to find someone who would be a good fit for our community. Someone who understands what we're about and shares our values. Elena felt her heart racing as she understood what he was offering.
You're asking me to come work on a ranch?
I don't know anything about cattle or horses. I'm asking you to come be part of a family, Jake said simply. The work can be learned. What can't be taught is the kind of character you've already shown. We need people who understand that sometimes protecting others means making sacrifices and who won't back down when things get difficult. The offer was tempting beyond words, but Elena had learned to be cautious about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Why would you want me? She asked. You barely know me. I know enough, Jake replied. I know you're willing to give up everything to protect someone you love. I know you're not afraid of hard work, and you're building a life based on helping others heal from trauma. I know you're alone in the world through no fault of your own, and you deserve to be part of something bigger than just surviving day to day. Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks as Jake's words touched something deep in her heart that she had tried to protect from hope and disappointment. I have commitments here, she said weakly. Isabella has been so good to me, and I'm volunteering with the support center. Isabella wants what's best for you, Jake said gently, and the support center will always need people like you. But you don't have to spend your whole life giving to others without accepting anything for yourself. You deserve to have a family that values you, work that challenges you, and a place where your strength and compassion are appreciated rather than punished. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Jake patiently answering Elena's questions about ranch life and the people who would become her new family. He told her about Thomas McKenna's vision of creating a place where people could heal and grow, about the satisfaction of working with animals and the land, and about the peace that came from being surrounded by people who understood that true strength sometimes looked like vulnerability, and that the greatest courage often went unrecognized by the world at large. As the rain continued to fall outside, Elena felt something shifting inside her heart. For the first time since leaving her family, she was being offered not just a job, but a place to belong. Jake wasn't asking her to change who she was or compromise her values. He was asking her to bring those values to a community that would cherish them rather than reject them. When Jake finally stood to leave, he placed a business card on the table with the ranch's address and phone number. "Think about it," he said quietly. "Take all the time you need. But know that there's a place for you with us if you want it, a place where standing up for what's right is seen as a virtue rather than a liability." Elena watched him walk out into the rain, her mind racing with possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. For the first time since leaving home, she wasn't just surviving. She was being offered the chance to truly live, surrounded by people who would understand and value the choice she had made to protect her sister. The future suddenly seemed full of hope and promise, as vast and open as the Texas sky. Elena spent 3 sleepless nights weighing Jake's offer, her mind cycling through hope and fear in equal measure. The idea of leaving the small but secure life she had built in San Antonio felt terrifying, but staying felt like choosing safety over the possibility of something extraordinary. On the 4th morning, she called the ranch and asked if she could visit before making her decision. Jake's voice warmed noticeably when he heard from her. "Of course," he said. "Thomas would love to meet you, and I think you should see the place before you decide. How about this weekend? I can pick you up Saturday morning and bring you back Sunday evening if you'd like." Isabella was thrilled when Elena told her about the invitation. "Mija, this could be exactly what you need," she said, using the affectionate term she had adopted for Elena months earlier. "You have given so much to others since you came here. Maybe it's time to let others give something back to you." Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of bright blue sky that made everything seem possible. Jake pulled up outside Elena's apartment building in a well-maintained pickup truck, and Elena felt her nervousness spike as she walked toward what might be the next chapter of her life. The drive to the ranch took them through rolling hills dotted with oak trees and past small towns that looked like postcards from an earlier era. Jake was an easy conversationalist, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area's history. Elena found herself relaxing despite her nervousness, drawn to his calm confidence and the obvious love he felt for this part of Texas. The Double Creek Ranch sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of prime cattle country, with the main house sitting on a rise that offered views of pastures stretching to the horizon. The house itself was a rambling structure that had been added to over the decades, creating a comfortable mix of architectural styles that somehow worked together perfectly. There were barns and outbuildings scattered across the immediate area, all well-maintained and showing the kind of care that came from people who took pride in their work. Thomas McKenna was waiting on the front porch when they arrived, and Elena liked him immediately. He was a tall man with silver hair and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take her measure in a single glance. His handshake was firm but gentle, and his welcome was warm without being overwhelming. "So, you're the young lady who's got Jake so interested in expanding our family," Thomas said with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "He's told me quite a bit about you, and I'm hoping you might consider joining us here at Double Creek." The tour began with the main house, which served as both Thomas's home and the heart of the ranch community. The kitchen was huge and clearly designed for feeding a crowd, with a long table that could seat 12 people comfortably. The living areas were warm and inviting, filled with comfortable furniture and photographs that told the story of the ranch's history and the people who had made it their home. Elena was particularly drawn to a wall of photographs showing ranch employees over the years. Thomas noticed her interest and began pointing out different people, sharing their stories with obvious pride and affection. There was Maria, who had come to the ranch as a single mother escaping an abusive relationship and was now the head of their horse training program. There was Carlos, who had arrived as a teenager aging out of foster care and was now studying veterinary medicine with the ranch's financial support. Each photograph represented someone who had found not just work but belonging at Double Creek. The small house that would be Elena's if she decided to stay was perfect in its simplicity. It had 2 bedrooms, a cozy living area, a functional kitchen, and a front porch that faced the pastures. The furnishing was basic but comfortable, and Jake explained that she would be free to decorate and modify the space however she wanted. "The rent comes out of your paycheck," Thomas explained as they walked through the house. "But it's minimal. We're not trying to make money off housing our people. We want everyone to be able to save money and build toward their future goals." The heart of Elena's nervousness centered around her complete lack of ranching experience. But Thomas and Jake seemed genuinely unconcerned about her lack of technical knowledge. "We'll teach you everything you need to know," Thomas assured her. "What we can't teach is character, work ethic, and the kind of integrity you've already demonstrated. The rest is just skills, and skills can be learned by anyone willing to put in the effort." Elena met several of the other ranch employees during her visit, and she was struck by the genuine warmth of their welcome and the obvious camaraderie they shared. At dinner in the main house that evening, she listened to conversations that ranged from ranch business to personal goals, from gentle teasing to serious discussions about world events. It felt like a real family gathering, complete with the comfortable dynamics of people who knew and cared about each other deeply. Sarah Montenegro, the veteran Jake had mentioned, was particularly welcoming. She was a woman in her late 20s who had found peace at the ranch after struggling with PTSD following her deployment in Afghanistan. "I was so angry when I first came here," Sarah confided, as she and Elena walked to the barn to check on a mare with a new foal. "Angry at the world, angry at myself, angry at everyone who didn't understand what I'd been through. Thomas and Jake didn't try to fix me or change me. They just gave me space to heal, and useful work to do while I figured things out." The conversation that sealed Elena's decision came later that evening, when she found herself alone with Thomas on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas had a way of making conversation that felt natural and unforced, and Elena found herself sharing details about her family situation that she rarely discussed with anyone. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately," she said quietly. "I know my parents did what they thought was right, even though it hurt so much. But I don't know how to bridge that gap between us. I don't know if there's a way back." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "Sometimes the greatest act of love is giving people space to realize their mistakes," he said finally. "Your family made their choice based on fear of scandal, fear of losing their place in the community, fear of standing out. That doesn't make their choice right, but it makes it human." He paused, watching a group of horses grazing in the nearby pasture. "You know, I've learned that sometimes families are the people who share your blood, and sometimes they're the people who share your values. Both kinds of family can be precious, but you can't force someone to value what you value or understand what you understand. All you can do is live your life in a way that honors your principles and hope that someday the people you love will recognize the courage it took." "Do you think they ever will?" Elena asked, voicing the hope she barely dared to acknowledge. "I think your sister knows what you sacrificed for her," Thomas said gently. "And I think someday, when she's old enough and strong enough to stand up for herself, she'll find a way to thank you for showing her what courage looks like. As for your parents, that's harder to say. But people do change, and love has a way of breaking through even the strongest walls of pride and stubbornness." That night, Aylin lay in the guest room and thought about everything she had seen and heard during her visit. The ranch felt like a sanctuary, a place where her values would be appreciated rather than tolerated. The work would be challenging and completely different from anything she had done before, but the people would become the family she had lost. Most importantly, she would be able to continue her education and her volunteer work while building skills and experience that could serve her throughout her life. The next morning, as Jake prepared to drive her back to San Antonio, Elena made her decision. "I'd like to accept your offer," she said simply. "I'd like to come home to Double Creek." Thomas's smile was radiant as he shook her hand to seal the agreement. "Welcome to the family, Elena. I have a feeling you're going to fit in here just perfectly." The transition happened quickly, with Elena giving Isabella 2 weeks' notice and arranging to transfer her volunteer responsibilities to the support center's weekend program. Isabella was sad to see her go, but excited about the opportunities that awaited her at the ranch. "You call me if you need anything," Isabella insisted as she hugged Elena goodbye. "And you come visit whenever you're in the city. You'll always have a family here at Luna's Kitchen." Moving to Double Creek felt like coming home in a way that surprised Elena with its intensity. Her small house quickly became a haven filled with the books she was studying for her counseling certification, photographs of Sophia, and small decorations that reflected her personal style. The work was indeed challenging. She learned to care for cattle, mend fences, operate machinery, and handle the 1,000 small tasks that kept a working ranch running smoothly. But it was the relationships that truly transformed her life. Sarah became a close friend and confidant, sharing both the struggles and triumphs of building a new life after trauma. Marcus taught her to ride horses and shared his knowledge of animal behavior with patient good humor. Danny, despite being several years younger, became like a little brother, full of energy and optimism that brightened even the hardest days. Jake remained a constant source of support and guidance, helping her learn the technical aspects of ranch work while respecting her independence and her need to prove herself. Their friendship deepened slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than romantic intensity. Elena appreciated his patience and his understanding that she needed time to heal and grow before she could consider opening her heart to love. Thomas became the father figure Elena had never really had. Someone who valued her thoughts and opinions, who encouraged her dreams and ambitions, and who never made her feel like her worth depended on staying small or quiet. Under his mentorship, she flourished in ways she had never imagined possible, developing confidence and leadership skills that served her well both on the ranch and in her continued volunteer work. The ranch community celebrated Elena's successes as she completed her certification in crisis counseling and began working part-time with a domestic violence organization in the nearest town. Her experiences at Double Creek had given her a deep understanding of how healing happened in community, and she brought that knowledge to her work with women who were rebuilding their lives after trauma. 6 months after arriving at the ranch, Elena received a letter that would test everything she had learned about forgiveness and family. The envelope bore her mother's careful handwriting and contained news that would change her understanding of her own story. As she sat on her front porch with the letter in her hands, Elena felt the past and present converging in ways she couldn't have predicted, opening possibilities she thought had been lost forever. Elena's hands trembled as she unfolded her mother's letter. The familiar handwriting blurred through tears she hadn't expected. Carmen Martinez had never been comfortable expressing emotions on paper, but the words that filled 3 pages spoke of months of regret, sleepless nights, and a growing understanding of the price Elena had paid for protecting Sophia. The letter began with an apology that seemed to pour straight from her mother's heart. Carmen wrote about the shame she felt for choosing community opinion over her daughter's courage, about the nights she lay awake wondering where Elena was and whether she was safe. She described the slow realization that Elena had been right about Mr. Hernandez and about the guilt that had consumed the family as they watched Sophia struggle with depression and trauma, while the man responsible faced no consequences for his actions.
But it was the news about Sophia that made Elena's heart race with hope and pride.
Her younger sister had begun attending counseling sessions and had slowly found the strength to speak more openly about her experiences. With the support of a new therapist who specialized in adolescent trauma, Sophia had begun to understand that the abuse was never her fault, and that Elena's actions had come from love rather than betrayal. Most remarkably, Sophia had started speaking at support groups for young assault survivors, sharing her story and Elena's sacrifice as an example of what true family loyalty looked like. She had told their parents that Elena was the bravest person she knew, and that the family's rejection of her had been their greatest failure. Sophia was now preparing to apply for colleges with strong social work programs, inspired by her sister's example of turning personal pain into a mission to help others. The letter continued with news that brought Elena both satisfaction and sorrow. Mr. Hernandez had finally faced consequences for his actions when a former student who had graduated several years earlier came forward with evidence that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The investigation that followed uncovered a pattern of abuse spanning more than a decade, and the man who had seemed untouchable was finally arrested and charged with multiple felony counts. Carmen wrote about the community's slow awakening to the truth they had worked so hard to deny. Many families were grappling with guilt over their failure to protect vulnerable young women, and some had reached out to offer belated apologies to the Martinez family.
The newspaper that had first published Elena's story was running a series of articles about institutional abuse and the courage required to speak truth to power, using Elena's actions as a model of moral leadership.
But perhaps most importantly, Carmen wrote about the conversation she had finally had with Roberto about their daughter's absence. Elena's father had struggled the most with admitting his mistake, his pride and traditional values warring with his growing understanding of what Elena had sacrificed. It had taken months of watching Sophia's pain and hearing her praise for her sister's courage before Roberto could acknowledge that he had failed Elena when she needed his support most. "Your father wants to call you," Carmen wrote. "He is not good with words when it comes to feelings, but he is proud of you. We all are. We were wrong to make you choose between protecting Sophia and staying with the family. You should never have had to make that choice, and we should have stood with you against anyone who tried to hurt our girls." The letter ended with a tentative invitation. Carmen wrote about their hope that Elena might consider coming home for a visit, not to stay necessarily, but to begin healing the wounds that their fear and pride had created. Sophia was desperate to see her sister and to thank her properly for the sacrifice she had made. The family wanted a chance to apologize in person and to show Elena that they had finally learned to value courage over comfort, truth over reputation. Elena sat on her porch for hours after reading the letter, watching the sun set over the pastures while processing emotions that ranged from joy to grief to cautious hope. The vindication she felt at finally being proven right was overshadowed by sadness for all the time they had lost, and the pain her family had endured while she was away. But underneath it all was a growing excitement at the possibility of reconciliation and the chance to rebuild relationships that had seemed permanently broken. Jake found her there, As darkness fell, and Elena shared the contents of the letter with him, he listened quietly, understanding the complexity of emotions she was wrestling with and the difficulty of deciding how to respond to her family's overture. "What does your heart tell you to do?" Jake asked gently. "It tells me to go home," Elena admitted. "But I'm scared that nothing has really changed, that they'll disappoint me again if things get difficult. And I'm scared that I've changed so much that I won't fit into their world anymore, even if they want me back." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully.
"You have changed," he said finally.
"You've grown stronger, more confident, more sure of your own worth. But those changes don't make you less capable of loving your family. They make you more capable of loving them without sacrificing yourself." He paused, watching the stars appear in the clear night sky. The Elena who left home a year ago felt responsible for everyone else's choices and reactions. The Elena who's sitting here now knows that you can love people without being responsible for fixing them or protecting them from the consequences of their own decisions. You can go home as yourself, not as the person they want you to be. Thomas was equally supportive when Elena shared her news with the ranch family the next morning. "Home will always be here for you," he assured her. "Whether you go for a visit or decide you need to be with your family for a while, you'll always have a place at Double Creek. We're not the kind of family that demands exclusive loyalty. We're the kind that supports each other's happiness, wherever that might lead." The decision to visit home felt both momentous and natural. Elena arranged to take a week off from the ranch and drove the familiar route toward her childhood town with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that made her stomach flutter. The landscape that had once felt like her entire world now seemed smaller and more manageable, viewed through eyes that had seen how much possibility existed beyond its borders. Sophia was waiting on the front porch when Elena pulled into the driveway, and the reunion between the sisters was everything Elena had hoped for and more. Sophia had grown taller and more mature in the year they had been apart, but her hug was fierce and desperate, as if she could somehow make up for all the lost time through the intensity of her embrace. "I'm so sorry," Sophia whispered through her tears. "I'm so sorry I let them make you choose. I'm so sorry I wasn't stronger sooner." "You were 15 and traumatized," Elena replied, holding her sister tight. "You don't owe me any apologies. I did what I did because I love you, not because I expected anything in return." The reunion with their parents was more awkward and emotional. Carmen cried openly as she hugged Elena, repeating apologies and promises that things would be different. Roberto struggled to find words for his regret, but his tears spoke more eloquently than any speech could have. The man who had once demanded that Elena choose between her principles and her family now seemed older and humbler, worn down by months of guilt and the realization of what his pride had cost them all. The conversations that followed over the next several days were difficult but healing. The family talked honestly about their fears, their mistakes, and their hopes for rebuilding their relationships. Elena shared stories about her life at the ranch, her work with trauma survivors, and her plans for the future. Her parents listened with a mixture of pride and regret, recognizing that the daughter they had cast out had flourished in ways they never could have imagined. Sophia's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable part of Elena's homecoming. The frightened, broken girl Elena had left behind had grown into a strong, articulate young woman who was channeling her pain into purpose. She showed Elena the scholarship applications she was preparing for college, her volunteer work with a local crisis hotline, and the journal where she had documented her healing journey. "I want to study social work like you," Sophia said as they sat together in their old bedroom. "I want to help other girls who are going through what I went through. But more than that, I want to be like you. I want to be the kind of person who stands up for what's right even when it costs everything." The visit also brought Elena face to face with the community that had rejected her, and she was surprised by how many people approached her with apologies and acknowledgements of her courage. The article series about institutional abuse had sparked important conversations about the responsibility adults had to protect children, and Elena's story had become a touchstone for discussions about moral courage. Mr. Hernandez's arrest and trial had vindicated Elena's accusations in the most public way possible, and many community members seemed eager to make amends for their previous skepticism and hostility. Elena accepted their apologies graciously, but without the desperate need for validation that might have motivated her a year earlier. The ranch had taught her that her worth didn't depend on other people's recognition or approval. The week passed quickly, filled with emotional conversations, shared meals, and the gradual rebuilding of trust and intimacy between family members, who had learned painful lessons about the cost of choosing comfort over courage. But as much as Elena treasured the reconciliation with her family, she found herself missing the ranch and the life she had built there. The realization came to her gradually that she had indeed changed in fundamental ways. The woman who had left this town in pain and isolation was not the same woman who was visiting it now. Elena had found her calling, her community, and her sense of purpose at Double Creek Ranch. And while she would always love her family, she no longer needed their approval to feel complete. On her last night at home, Elena sat with Sophia under the stars and talked about their future. Sophia would graduate from high school in a few months and had been accepted to several colleges with strong social work programs. Elena invited her to visit the ranch during summer break, promising to show her the life she had built and the family she had found among people who shared their values. "I'm so proud of you," Sophia said quietly. "Not just for what you did for me, but for everything you've accomplished since. You could have let what happened to us make you bitter and angry, but instead, you used it to help other people heal. You're everything I want to be when I grow up." Elena's parents drove her to the bus station for her return journey to the ranch, and their goodbye was tearful but hopeful. Carmen pressed a small package into Elena's hands. A photo album filled with pictures from Elena's childhood and letters that family members had written but never sent during their year of separation. "We want you to know that you were never forgotten," Carmen said. "You were always our daughter, even when our fear made us act like you weren't. We hope you'll come visit again soon, and we hope you'll bring some of your ranch family with you. We want to meet the people who saw your value when we were too blind to see it ourselves." The bus ride back to Double Creek gave Elena time to process the emotional intensity of her homecoming and to think about the future she was returning to. She felt a deep sense of closure about her past and excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. The reconciliation with her family was precious, but it was the knowledge that she had built a life worth living that gave her the greatest satisfaction. Jake was waiting at the bus station when she arrived, and his smile told her everything she needed to know about how much she had been missed. As they drove back to the ranch together, Elena shared the highlights of her visit and the news about Sophia's college plans. "I've been thinking," Jake said as they turned into the ranch's long driveway. "Thomas has been talking more seriously about retirement, and he's asked me if I'd be interested in buying the ranch when he's ready to step down. I'd want to continue his vision of making this a place for people who need second chances, but I'd also like to expand the counseling and support services we offer." He glanced at Elena with a look that was both hopeful and nervous. "I was wondering if you might be interested in being a partner in that venture. Your experience and training would be invaluable, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather build a future with, both professionally and personally." Elena felt her heart racing as she understood the implications of what Jake was offering. It wasn't just a business partnership he was proposing, but a life partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. The timing felt perfect. She had made peace with her past, found her calling, and was ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. "I'd like that very much," she said simply, reaching across the truck cab to take his hand. As they pulled up to the main house, Elena could see the lights glowing warmly in the windows and several figures moving around inside, preparing for the evening meal that brought the ranch family together every day. She was home, not just to a place, but to a community that valued courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over everything else. The woman who had once been cast out for protecting her sister had found her way to exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who understood that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when everything familiar falls away. Elena Martinez had lost one family for speaking the truth, but she had gained so much more: a calling, a community, a love worth waiting for, and most importantly, an unshakable knowledge of her own worth and strength. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility, and Elena was ready to embrace whatever challenges and joys it might bring. She had learned that being cast out was sometimes just the beginning of finding where you truly belonged, and that the courage to stand up for what's right was always rewarded, even if the rewards came in ways you never could have imagined.